Morning, everybody. You have no idea how great it is to be back to in-person programming after our renovation. Coming up here and introducing someone and having them kind of talk to a camera, or maybe one or two people, so we get a little interaction and question and answers, has been difficult, but isn't the space great? And isn't the comfortable chairs awesome? The chairs, we actually owe a huge thank you to Minders Community Library. They have had the building that they are using purchased by Herm Minders, and they're doing some renovation. These are from the church that was in the building, and they were going to be surplus property, and they were gifted to the Historic Society, so sure beats those hard folding chairs we had in the past. So we're very appreciative, and I put that out there on our Coffee Talk videos, so all of you out there in our internet land that is watching this, you're missing out on a really comfortable chair. Next time, if it works out, you'll have to go. Oh, and the coffee. Good. Glad you're enjoying the coffee. So it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Gabe Yellowhawk. He is with the Pipestone National Monument, and I can let him tell more about his position there. But I know he's been at the museum a few times over the last several months doing some research on his topic for today. So I'm going to be interested in learning what he's discovered, because I know he has spent many hours scrolling through microfilm finding the details that we as a historic society don't know. So we appreciate your efforts, and we're all going to get educated today. Thanks for coming.
Oh, thank you. Hi, my name's Gabriel Yellowhawk. I'm a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe. I'm also a biological science technician at Pipestone National Monument. I've been working for the monument for about 3 years now and living in Pipestone for the same amount of time. I started research on the Pipestone Indian Boarding School, or the Pipestone Indian Training School, about a year ago, or a year and a half ago. During the winter hours at Pipestone, we're mostly closed down, but due to the low visitation hours, I spent most of my time researching the school, spending a lot of time here at the museum, looking through the old newspapers, the Pipestone County Star, microfilm, and researching this topic. I have some experience in historical research. I worked for the curation department at the Crazy Horse Memorial for about a year, and then before that I was an intern at the Black Hills Museum of Geology before I came to Pipestone. So this is my presentation on the Pipestone Indian Training School. I go over mostly a history of the boarding school system and Indian policy in America, sort of as a framing point.
Could you talk just a little longer?
Oh, sure. Yep.
Yeah, please.
So to start us off, let's see. Oops. There we go. I usually go over a history of Pipestone itself and the Indian policy in America. So for time immemorial, the Pipestone quarries have been used by Native people to gather the pipestone for ceremony to use for their pipes. In 1858, we had the Treaty of the Yankton Sioux Tribe, also known as the Honktawa. This is also called the Treaty of Washington, where the Honktawan people ceded most of their territory or their eastern territory to the United States government, with the exception of Pipestone, because of its significance for the quarries. They designated this place to be protected for their tribe and Native people. So Pipestone became a reservation at that time. Let's see. In 1879, Carlisle is the first government boarding school in America. Opened its doors. This began what we call the boarding school era. In 1887, the Dawes Act is enacted. The Dawes Act was a policy in America to divide Native American territory, train them into allotments. Both these acts were sponsored by groups in Washington, sort of the New England era. Yes?
Where was the Carlisle School then?
That was in, what was it? Arizona, I believe. Sort of like eastern side, yeah.
Okay.
You actually see these figures on the left and right side are Carlisle students, the sort of before and after going to Carlisle. So the Dawes Act divided Indian Territory into allotments. Both of these policies were enacted by a group called the Friends of the Indians. They're a Washington group, mostly like progressive New Englanders and wealthy people who wanted to uplift Native American people and bring them into a sort of Americanized version of themselves. The idea was to sort of assimilate Native people into white European or Victorian era culture. And these two main acts were their sort of thoughts, because Native people during this time often used the land communally. So you had very large family groups, and the land was shared, and people lived in very tight but large family groups. So the Dawes Act wanted to separate people into more, what's the word, like nuclear families. So one family owning, or one male in the family owning the land, and then being separated off into having each individual farms. So the land was divided into basically every adult male was given sections of land, and land that wasn't being used would be allotted off and then sold to whoever was going to purchase it. About 100 million acres of Native American land was lost during this time. So during this time, in 1893, the Pipestone Indian Training School opens. So this is still, the reservation is still present in Pipestone, and the boarding school is built on reservation land just north of here, so most people know where the boarding school is, or what it was. 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act is enacted. So this gave Native people the right to become citizens in America. Of course, there's differences in the amount of time. Some Native people became citizens before this. My own family, we became citizens in 1879. My father, or my ancestor, Chief Yellowhawk, applied for citizenship in 1876. We used to live, our family lived in sort of where the Oahe Dam area is now. We used to call it Peoria Bottom. So our family had been there for generations, and after the treaties, basically all the land west of the river was given to Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, and all the land east to it was sort of ceded to America. And of course, our family lived on the east side, so we'd been there for generations, but settlers started coming in saying, you gotta get out of here. So my grandfather went to the land office and applied for citizenship, and after that he applied for a homestead, and we got land on our side of the river. Then the Oahe Dam got built and they flooded it, but. So 1940, the termination era begins. This is an era in American history where basically the policy was to, instead of having to deal with treaty rights or Native American as sovereign nations, Congress thought it'd be easier just to terminate tribes. I strip them of their native status and say, you're no longer a tribe, you're just an American. These almost 100 tribes were terminated this way. Basically, their rights were given over to states, and they became citizens, essentially. A lot of this is pretty prevalent to Minnesota history. Many of the Minnesotan tribes were terminated. Upper Sioux community, Lower Sioux, Prairie Islands, many Wisconsin tribes as well. But a lot of those tribes got their sovereignty back. Then in 1953, the Pipestone Indian Training School closes. So this is sort of in the termination era when tribes are starting to be thought of as less as sovereign nations and more as just sort of tribes to tick off the map and become Americans. So the reasons for having the boarding school and assimilating Native people was seen as sort of almost unnecessary at this point. 1956, begins the Indian Relocation Act. This was a policy in America where Native families were encouraged to leave their reservation. The government would give stipends to men to leave their homes, go to different cities, Minneapolis, Dallas, California, Los Angeles, San Francisco. They were encouraged to basically vacate the reservation and then try and find jobs in these cities, and they're promised homes and jobs. And the unfortunate thing is most of these families, when they left the reservation, were sort of on their own. They're away from their families. When they arrived in these big cities, they found there weren't as many jobs as they were promised. Homes were much more expensive, and so more increased poverty. But one of the upsides, or I should say, in spite of all of that, a lot of pan-indigenous communities rose up. Think of like the American Indian movements, the All Tribes movement in California. So you have lots of people moving to these urban settings from various different tribes from all across America and organizing on political movements, essentially. So we move on to the future. 1968, the Indian Civil Rights Act is passed. So sort of tailing on to the Civil Rights Acts that are happening in the 1960s. More and more Native people started speaking out. Groups are starting to organize. 1969, the occupation of Alcatraz. So the All Tribes movement organizes a protest and takes the Alcatraz prison as a sort of protest movement. Then 1973, we have the occupation of Wounded Knee, put on by the American Indian movement. So we're seeing lots of these protests and different occupations throughout America. Then 1975, after a lot of these political movements come across, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act is enacted in government. So this begins what we call today as the determination era. So most tribes start to reclaim their rights. Many of those tribes that were terminated earlier begin to start getting their tribal roles back, become sovereign nations again. During this time, a lot of tribal colleges start to rise up. Myself, I went to, or I graduated from the Oglala Dakota College, which is a tribal college based out of Pine Ridge, but has satellite schools throughout South Dakota. But that was founded during this time in the wake of the American Indian movement. Then 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act is enacted, and the American Indian Freedom or Religious Freedom Act is enacted. The Child Welfare Act basically protected children who were being adopted out of their families. In the 60s, end of the 50s, it was a very prevalent problem where if a child was orphaned or if their parents were deemed unfit to care for them, those children would be sent off to reservation or off the reservation and given to white families instead of going to their immediate relatives. The Indian Child Welfare Act sort of put more emphasis on giving those children to their own families or their immediate family groups, and gave more jurisdiction to the tribes to decide these things. I think recently now that's this act itself is becoming a question in Congress. They're thinking of getting rid of the Indian Child Welfare Act in the Supreme Court. So that's a current issue right now. And then the American Indian Religious Freedom Act basically gave us the right to practice our religion. Before this time, many of our religious ceremonies were still outlawed in certain states. The Sundance ceremony, sweat lodge, even powwows, you can see in the background there, were outlawed. Then in 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission occurs in Canada. This happens after the number of hidden graves in a lot of the residential schools in Canada. So we had the boarding school system here in America. Canada sort of adopted our policy to their Indigenous people, the First Nations people in Canada, and people investigated some of those residential schools and found mass graves of children at these residential schools. So Canada starts to research this, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission begins 2008. So following this, here in the States, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition is founded to research more of the boarding schools in America. In 2016, we have the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. We see a lot more environmental protests happening in the Native American community. Then we have the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women in Canada. It comes after the Highway of Tears, where many Indigenous women are found missing and murdered in Canada, and most of these reports are going unreported or non-investigated. So inquiries are sent in, and people start talking about it more. And it's a current problem too in the States as well. I know it was like during the beginning of the year, almost 22 women disappeared in South Dakota alone, and still we don't know what's going on. Well, in 2019, Operation Lady Justice is enacted. That was during the Trump administration to sort of investigate some of the missing people that have been occurring in the United States. Then in 2021, Deb Haaland is confirmed as Secretary of the Interior, and she begins the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. This initiative encourages sort of the federal government to investigate the boarding schools that were enacted during the past and research those children who had passed away at the boarding schools. To talk more about Pipestone in particular, except from the timeline, it was in operation from 1893 to 1953. It was built for the purpose of all like boarding schools to assimilate Native American children into American culture, constructed on the reservation land without the consent of the Hongtua Oyate, also known as Yankton Sioux Tribe. The Yankton also protested the boarding school itself when it was built. Essentially, they weren't asked if a boarding school should be built onto their reservation land, and they filed for a suit. Later on, the Yankton Sioux Tribe sued the government for building the boarding school as well as the building of the railroad through the reservation. Eventually, this courts filed in favor of the Yankton Sioux Tribe and gave the tribe a monetary compensation for taking the land. But in doing so, the federal government also took claim over the land. So the land was, since they gave them money, the land defaulted into the federal government's control. And so that's where we're at right now.
Is that all the land or just the railroad?
So the land was divided up after the reservation was defaulted to the government. So part of it went to Fish and Wildlife, part of it went to the Pipestone National Monument, part of it now is a Minnesota West School and Good Sam, and I think I forget what other properties are over there, but that generally was sort of just divided up. So for the school itself, it's estimated over 4,000 children were sent to the Indian Training School over its years of operation. We get this number just from the student files that are online. Those files list about 3,920 some children. Those are available on the Kansas City archives, which have a lot of archival data. Those records only go to 1910 though. And the other numbers just come from research for the early years from the newspaper research. I believe in the first year, 1893, there's about 60 students who were here. And those children came from a variety of tribes, basically all over Minnesota as well as Wisconsin, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota. So we have people from, or children from Nakota, Lakota, Ojibwe, Sac and Fox, Oneida, Mohawk, Omaha, Potawatomi, Winnebago, Menominee, Groventure, Arikara, Mandan, Muncie, Mohican. And this was a policy in a lot of boarding schools as well. The main idea being that if children are from different tribes and you gather them up, they won't be able to speak their language to each other, so they'll have to learn English and assimilate into American culture to be able to be friends, essentially. This led to one thing, sort of an undue effect, that there was a lot more, after the boarding school system, there was much more pan-indigenous thought into Native communities today because we're many different tribes. For myself, I'm Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe. That's my federally recognized tribe, but I'm also Lakota and Onondaga and Wyandot. So there's much diversity in the Native American community today because of what happened here. So for the curriculum and policy, like most government schools, Pipestone was focused on vocational education up to the 8th grade. Boys were taught farm work, industrial work. Girls were taught sewing and housework. This was also sort of the trying to amplify like American ideals. It created sort of a clash in Native American communities because there's a difference in gender roles, essentially. A lot of Native American tribes, including my own, had more of a matriarchal system where women were allowed to hunt, allowed to farm, were decision makers in communities, and also like doctors and teachers. And the American system sort of put that down, said that men should be superior to women and live in like this, nuclear household kind of thing. So at Pipestone, runaways were a common occurrence. The newspaper reports runaways happening many times in the early years and in continuing on. Solitary confinement was one method that was used to discipline children. I remember one incident that's detailed in one of the newspapers is that 3 boys left the school. They just sort of walked out and they boarded a train and are trying to go up to Wisconsin. And whenever students would run away, the superintendent of the school would basically send messages out to all the law enforcement in the area. Those law enforcement would try and capture the children and then arrest them. They'd be kept in jail until the superintendent could arrive and then retrieve the kids and then bring them back to Pipestone. When the superintendent caught these 3 boys who had escaped, I believe they were found in like Marshall. He brought them back, and then they were kept in a place called, it's often referred to as the dungeon in the boarding school. And they were kept there for about, I believe it was 8 days in solitary confinement. And these were like 8 to 10-year-olds. And there were a few, we still don't know much about how many children died at the Pipestone Indian Training School. We know that at least 4 children are buried on the school grounds, or were buried on the school grounds in an unmarked cemetery. That cemetery was abandoned in 1904. The reasons being, one of the employees, when asked or interviewed about it, they said that the Indians are now buried in Woodlawn Cemetery or sent home. So the location of that school cemetery is still unknown at this time. In 1933, a site was uncovered by the IECW, or the Indian Emergency Conservation Workers, and they were clearing out some brush near the school, and they found what they called a Indian burial ground. Later on, the superintendent of the school asked for that area to be designated as a park area, and then erected a monument that said "Peace Forever" onto it. Then I think in 56 that monument was removed at some point. Those people didn't really know what it was for. There are probably some students just from research that are at Old Woodlawn. We're still researching or trying to get to the bottom of how many children died or were sent to Old Woodlawn. I remember listening to an old one of these coffee talks, and I believe someone was researching grave sites, and he mentioned that about 400 or so, or maybe like 450 unmarked graves are at Old Woodlawn. So that's definitely one possibility of where the children could be at. The picture here is of the Augie family. Barty Augie is one child that we know passed on at Pipestone. His body and remains were sent back to his reservation. He's the little boy at the far top left corner. Oops. So for current research, most of what I've been doing is researching the County Star newspaper. The local newspaper has been printing local news since 1879. The newspaper often mentions the boarding school, sometimes names, where the children came from, sometimes their tribal affiliation. The hope is to use these articles to learn more about the children during these early years, learn where they came from, what happened to them, where they went in life. Right now, the monument is working with the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition and consulting with the tribes that are affiliated with Pipestone National Monument to see how the tribes want to progress with the boarding school. And here's some pictures of some of the students or some of the children who were sent to the Pipestone boarding school that I've collected through this about the year of research. And that's the end of my presentation. I open up to any questions, really.
You know how many schools were in Minnesota?
Minnesota. I'm not too sure. I could look up on right now you can look up on the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, or NABS, N-A-B-S. There are about, I believe, 395 schools that have been identified in America, and they have a list of which ones are state by state.
Do you know of anyone that actually went to the school that's still living?
There are people who went to school that are still living. Again, there's I know who is it? Adam Fortunate Eagle. He wrote a book about his time at Pipestone. I believe it's My Time at Pipestone. And yeah, there are still people who went to the boarding school. Of course, the boarding school itself also changed throughout the years, so people have different experiences in different years, really. Yep.
Is that building being preserved? I haven't been out there for a while, but.
The only building that's left is the superintendent's quarters.
Okay.
I believe it's in pretty bad disrepair at the moment, and right now it's in, I believe, property of the Pipestone Indian Shrine Association. So they're also consulting with their tribal partners or our tribal partners to discuss what they want to do with it, really.
Okay. And so now, currently, it's not considered as being on the monument grounds. It's being Fish and Parks or something, you said?
It's a Pipestone Indian Shrine Association, so a private organization owns it.
Oh.
I think someone bought it at one point and then gifted it to them.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So.
After the school closed, we're aware that the city of Pipestone first bought like the land where the Good Sam and Minnesota West are, because there was a well and a water tower on that property, and the city wanted it for the water purposes. Eventually, it's been sold off, so
Yeah.
there's multiple owners of that section the city once had
Yeah.
bought.
Which was originally designated as being
Yeah. the reservation.
It's going to be owned by the tribe, right? Or
It was, there was
Yeah.
a treaty in 1858 that set aside 1 square mile
Mhm.
around
Yep.
the sacred quarry area, around the Nicollet marker, and it was the Pipestone Indian Reservation.
Mhm.
Oh, yes.
Yep.
So they're broken.
Mhm. Yep.
Very nice presentation, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, yeah.
You mentioned that, like, you are a combination of different tribes.
Mhm.
Is that a concept that is appreciated among tribes, or would they rather kept the, kind of their own bloodline? Or what's the-
It's a hard question to answer, really. In our tribes, we often have our own rules about who you are. You know, if you're your mother's tribe, are you from the land that you're born in? Are you from the person that you identify as, you know, the tribe that you're raised with? All of those concepts got changed around during the reservation era. So we have the idea of blood quantum was introduced into the reservation era. This idea of being partially like full-blooded or half-blooded, quarter blood, comes from pedigree, so like eugenics sort of thing going on. Back in those days, though, you see this a lot when we're looking at census records from the 1800s. People who are presenting as being more European, if they wore hats, if they were practiced Christianity, they would just be labeled as half-blood, and then everybody else would be full-blooded. So today, I'd say it's really appreciated, but again, many tribes have different laws so a lot of those tribes still have the same blood quantum laws. Other tribes have heritage, if you can know descendancy. Other ones have, if your mother is part of that tribe, then you're allowed. So I'm Onondaga, but I'm not federally recognized as Onondaga because I get my my history from my father, and he's Onondaga because he has it from his mother, and so both of them are considered Onondaga essentially. Yeah.
I know in some countries that's the case, like in Jordan.
Yeah.
If your mother is, you know, Jordanian, it might not count as much as if your dad is.
Yep.
There's a lot of,
Mhm. Yep. We all have our different ways. Yeah.
Kind of off the subject, but, and it's probably easily found out, but how many years back do they say Native people were coming to Pipestone, to quarry?
Traditionally, we say like as time immemorial, but going back to the Oneoti culture and the I forget the woodland culture. So back in the sort of ancient civilizations of America, you find pipestone artifacts and uses of the quarries, and all throughout America as well, we find pipestone from the trade networks. So long time.
And this is the only place where Pipestone is. Are there others, or?
This certain like pipestone quality is only found here in Pipestone. There's other like quarries where people would get stone to make pipes, black pipestone, white pipestone, in different areas throughout America, but this area was significant. This is like the best pipes, and culturally very important. Yeah.
And it's unfortunate, the petroglyphs that were in the area were taken out, but now
Yeah.
are on display.
Yeah.
And those are realized as being quite ancient, I guess, is that
Yeah.
correct?
There's many different stories about where the petroglyphs come from. I know one story is that, or one of our stories is that there's people who were camped out at the Three Maidens, because that's the traditional entrance of the quarries, and they're staying there to dig pipestone, and as they're camped out, there's a thunderstorm that came around, and as the thunder came, everyone went inside their tents, and lightning was happening, and someone looked out their tent and saw lightning strike the Three Maidens, and they're looking at it, and then it struck again and again, and they looked out and they saw a man standing up like this, and it was like a silhouette as lightning struck, and then they say the stones appeared afterwards. So it goes back to mythology and ancient culture, really. Yeah.
pretty amazing that we have this right here.
Yeah.
You know,
Mhm.
significant that
Yeah,
we're still living among it.
true, very true. Oh, yeah.
Is the legend of Gitche Manitou, and this is off topic, but is the legend of Gitche Manitou accurate from a tribal perspective, or is it to some extent a figment of Longfellow's imagination?
I would say it's a collection. It's like I'd say it's from my perspective, it's like a game of telephone, really, because he heard it from another person, who heard it from another person, kind of thing, and then sort of adapted it, and then like wrote into a poem, and then like changed it up some more. Like I noticed when I first moved here 3 years ago, I noticed all the Hiawatha signs, and I was like, oh, cool, Hiawatha, because myself, I'm Onondaga from my grandmother, and Hiawatha, we call him Ienawatha, which is, he's a great peacemaker among the Iroquois people. Before the Iroquois Confederate was founded, there were 7 different tribes, and Ienawatha was an Onondaga chief who brought peace to the people, along with his the peacemaker and the other chieftains, and said we were no longer having war, and they buried and formed our sort of government. And then come over to Minnesota, which is very far away from New York, where that story was originally told, and to see our ancestors' name kind of put about. But I think Longfellow just saw the name Hiawatha and put it into his poem. So there's a lot of or editing of the story, I would say.
Artistic legend.
Yeah, yeah.
When I look at that picture, I see those kids, you know, like their clothing and their hair. I mean, they were, was their original clothing, hairstyle very abruptly taken away from them?
Yeah. So you'd arrive at the school, and the experience differs among people, but usually they would shave your hair right off the bat in your first days, and then get you a uniform, delouse you, and assign you cots and beds and things like that. So that happened when you came.
And then you couldn't speak your own language, you needed to know English.
Yeah. And the policy differs throughout the years. Of course, like assimilation became less of a factor in the later years as termination era begins. So people are not considered tribes anymore. So, and most people speak English anyways at that point. But yes, language was discouraged.
Well, it looks like we've kind of wrapped up the question portion of it, so I'd like to thank you all again for coming, and thank you again for your presentation. It's a very fascinating topic. I am a person that loves the people stories, so the fact that you're researching the children and trying to learn more about the stories, like, speaks to me, and I do that with lots of the early people that settled here, so I'm glad that somebody's doing this, and I'm going to be watching and listening for what you learn, because I like to know the stories of the person. I think the story of an area is the story of the people, so thank you for doing the research and for sharing with us what you know.
No, thank you.